At this time, I'd like to introduce Gary Jones, Vice President of EHS at Printing United Alliance, to talk about the benefits of Wisconsin printers from SGP and the Green Tier program. Gary?
Oh, thanks, Joe. And I want to thank everyone for taking time out of their busy schedule to join with us this afternoon to hear about this exciting program. We were talking before the webinar started, and I really think this is a very timely topic, and we're very excited to have David from the DNR to walk us through it. A few things about the Green Tier and SGP program. It's now easier for Wisconsin printers to demonstrate and share your company's commitment to becoming part of the environmental, social governance, and circular economy. You can do this by joining one of the two premier or both premier programs, Wisconsin Green Tier and Sustainable Grain Printing Partnership. The Wisconsin Printing Industry Council works closely together with both programs to make sure that the requirements of these programs align with each other. In fact, they're very complementary. Being able to get recognized under Green Tier or certified under SGP is really easy to do. The criteria match up very nicely. It's an easy transition for both of the programs. So it really makes it easier for someone to join one, the other, or ideally both. Printers that seek local and national acknowledgement of their commitment to sustainable business practices can be certified by both Green Tier and SGP through, as we said, a streamlined process. We encourage Wisconsin printers to join both programs. Feel free to reach out to myself or one of the sponsoring organizations that Joe covered on the first slide for more information about either one of the programs, and we'd be more than happy to help. Okay, next slide.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Gary. At this time, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. It is David S. Panscoffy, professional engineer. David has been an engineer with the Department of Natural Resources since 1990, following graduation with a BS degree in civil and environmental engineering from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. David has held roles in the Wisconsin DNR in both the air management and the hazardous waste management programs. David has developed expertise within the hazardous waste regulations regarding VOCs, fugitive air emissions, tank systems, and hazardous secondary materials. Welcome, David.
Thanks so much. Great to be with you. Thank you, Gary Jones from the Printing United Alliance and Joe Lyman from the Great Lakes Graphics Association. I really appreciate the invitation. I'm hoping everybody can hear me okay. I'm assuming yes. So here I am. I'm not sure if anyone has flown recently, and you know how FAA has these required sort of spiels about safety, and they've gotten really nice and really fun. You know, they're like showing people in tropical paradise in some kind of a cane chair, and their pools when they put on the safety vests. Well, this photo, of course, is AI generated to make it seem like it's going to be a lot of fun today. And it's not going to be as good as the FAA has been doing to make their required presentations look a little more fun. But it's important. I think it's going to be important for you guys to sort of see the tough stuff first, which is sort of the hazardous waste regulations as they pertain to tank systems that are accumulating hazardous waste. So we'll start there, and then we'll kind of naturally go into the HSM, the hazardous secondary material. So I'm going to start off, and we're going to talk about tank systems a little bit. Again, hazardous waste tank systems. I'll go through some definitions. We'll talk really briefly about design and management standards. We'll briefly talk about hazardous air emissions and how they might apply. We'll talk a little bit about how ancillary equipment is part of tank systems, and there's some confusing equipment, and then ultimately paths to compliance. So how does RCRA define a tank? And RCRA, we know, I'm going to try not to talk too many acronyms. The Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Coming from solid waste, I know that there's also subpart D, not just C, but so usually when you're in the hazardous waste program talk, you talk about RCRA assuming that it means hazardous waste rules. So I'm talking about how RCRA hazardous waste rules defines a tank in haz waste service. They call it a stationary device. It's designed to contain an accumulation of hazardous waste. That's very important. Constructed primarily of non-earthen materials, kind of goes without saying, but could be wood, never seen one. Concrete, not usual. Steel, very common. Plastic, nah, not usual. Sometimes fiberglass. And it has to provide structural support. That's how it's defined. You know, you look at stuff like this, you go, oh, that's a tank, obviously. They're hazardous waste tanks, but you know, do we know whether subchapter J applies, which are the tank standards for large quantity generators and small quantity? Do the air emissions controls apply to these types of tanks, which would be a level 1 in the subpart CC? Who knows? A little bit. It takes a little bit of doing. What about these tanks? These might look more familiar to some of you. One has been indicated that it is hazardous waste. So it doesn't have to be big. It can be small. It can be near areas of production, but in this case, it's a spent solvent. So just a quick overview of some of the tank system requirements. LQG, large quantity generators and small quantity generators share some requirements. And those 4 boxes on the left side are the things that are shared with both small quantity and large quantity generators. And that would include things like labeling, general operating procedures, periodic inspections, spill response. And then the large quantity generator requirements are quite a bit more robust and have more requirements. And so in here are design and installation standards, secondary containment and release detection, even setbacks and segregation for some types of waste, probably not ones that you're dealing with. And then air emissions. And the subpart or subchapter dealing with tanks is really CC, which deals with containers and tanks. And then there are other ones that are part of air emissions. But those air emission rules and hazardous waste rules are really only for large quantity generators. They would also apply to treatment, storage, and disposal facilities. So what about other parts of tank system? You know, it doesn't say, we don't just say the tank rules, we talk about the tank system rules. And we know that there are lots of pieces of ancillary equipment that are really part of a tank system. That includes things like piping and fitting and flanges, various types of pumps and valves. You're probably familiar with a lot of these different things. And sometimes these things are also subject to the air emission standards for leak detection and repair, or the subchapter BB. So this is a very busy slide, but it's trying to get at the difficulty with the applicability for some of the air emissions rules for haz waste. But in essence, I've circled a couple of things here. If a tank is storing or accumulating materials with a volatile organic concentration of greater than 500 part per million by weight, which isn't a whole lot of VOCs, and if it's at an LQG, it's pretty likely that subchapter CC of the air emissions is actually going to apply. So these are some of these pieces of equipment that would be associated with tank systems and that often would be subject to the subchapter CC, again, if it's the large quantity generator. And you know what these are? You probably do. These are what we refer generally to as conservation vents. Some of these have some flame arresters associated with them. The conservation vent on the left side, that right side is the vacuum portion, and then there's the pressure side of it. And so conservation vents are really just pressure operated valves that allow relief from excess pressure or vacuum from the head space. And they're really important to keep tanks from getting damaged. And of course, they're used to conserve the contents, and that's why they're called conservation vents. What about these things? These are also part of tank systems. They're special equipment. They're safety devices. Usually they're separate than the conservation vents. They can be different styles, but sometimes they're a little bit confusing, but these are also covered under the air emissions portion under CC. What's interesting with the safety devices is that they are actually following a schedule that's shown in subchapter BB or subpart BB if you use the federal language. I won't get into them too much, but They're just part of those pieces of equipment on top of tanks. If you're a large quantity generator and then you're in the tank subchapter CC rules. So what are the paths to compliance for dealing with tank systems? Well, there's the simple one. You just meet the hazardous waste tank systems regulations, which are in subchapter J, and they're also in subchapter CC, and they might even be in BB for certain types of equipment. But of course, like all rules in the hazardous waste program, there are tons of different exemptions. If a unit is a wastewater treatment unit, probably not the types of tank systems that have spent solvent. Sometimes there might be something like that at a facility that you might be familiar with. Elementary neutralization units, certainly product tanks are not in the haz waste realm. Sometimes a temporary response tank, an emergency tank is used that. And oftentimes what had a few years ago been asked by a few facilities about, isn't it closed loop if we do this or do that? We know that we've been pretty consistent with Region 5 that it really needs to be part of the manufacturing process, and it doesn't involve spent solvents that are part of like degreasing and cleaning. Needless to say, it brings into this next important thing that I'm going to talk about next, which are the exclusions. Okay, so there are these tank rules, but then this hazardous secondary material provides this conditional exclusion, really for the reclamation and reuse of solvent. So that's going to be sort of the important part of the next part of the presentation. Is really going to talk about a lot of definitions, really just how it will get implemented, and this hazardous secondary materials. As a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about, I'll do a little bit of intro. We'll do a lot more definitions because I think it's important. We're going to spend most of the time on the generator-based exclusion. I'll briefly mention the transfer-based exclusion. I'll also talk real briefly about legitimate recycling, just because that was part of that rule package that brought in this hazardous secondary materials. And then we'll talk about some resources, some that are kind of new. So hopefully that will be helpful. So with this rule package a few years ago that went through in Wisconsin, the definition of solid waste, which came from federal rules, it really expanded the types of hazardous secondary materials, or HSM, that could be reclaimed outside of the hazardous waste rules, and with caveats, so hence a conditional exclusion. And there was also in that rule package the definition of legitimate recycling, which I'll touch on briefly towards the end of the presentation. So some of the parts that were covered in this rule package, a lot of these things just fall under the they're all HSM related, is the generator controlled exclusion, which is probably the most important one for the folks that are listening to this webinar today. There's also the transfer-based exclusion, which I'll pay a little bit of time to. And then there's a remanufacturing exclusion, which I won't cover at all because it's really dealing with a very couple specific sectors, like the pharmaceutical sector, the organic chemical manufacturing, and 18 specific sort of high-grade solvents. So that one isn't so applicable. And then the legitimate recycling was part of that rule package that came through. So naturally, we want to talk about some definitions. What is HSM? So one, a secondary material, a spent material like a spent solvent, for example. And then the second is if it were to get discarded, it would be a hazardous waste. Who is an HSM generator? Any person whose act or process produces hazardous secondary material at the generating facility. What's a generating facility? It means all continuous property owned, leased, or otherwise controlled by the HSM generator. A facility that collects hazardous secondary material from other persons is not the hazardous secondary material generator. So here's a little graphic of the generator controlled exclusion, and they're kind of like three sort of flavors of it, and they're all kind of very much related. The first one is this reclaimed on-site by the generator or contractor. That's typical. If you have a distillation unit on site for your facility, you have a spent solvent, that would be applicable. Sometimes the reclamation happens off-site at a facility that's under the control or maybe a parent company. And then the last one is this reclaim through a written contract, kind of a tolling agreement. And I think of that as really an agreement for both the manufacturer and the manufacture of those spent materials. So that's all under the generator controlled exemption or exclusion. So this is a slide that Mike Ellenbecker, our Haz Waste coordinator at DNR, helped work on, and it's really talking about more shipment of HSM, to states that might not have adopted the 2018, our last version, which is this 2018 exclusion, and basically saying now if a state nearby has adopted the 2018 transfer, or I shouldn't say transfer-based exclusion, but it has the exclusion in hand, that it wouldn't be hazardous waste at the border. If the state has not adopted it, it becomes hazardous waste at the transfer. So this is a graphic. I won't really spend time on it. It's basically also adapted from McCoy and Associates, who have a great reference that I'll provide you at the end. This is sort of just showing reclaimed on site, a production process, generation of a hazardous secondary material, some accumulation of that hazardous secondary material, and then reclamation. And so showing that this is what we're talking about. There could be a point of generation at that reclamation that might be subject to the hazardous waste rules, but the vast majority, including the tanks and the transfer, is all part of this exclusion. This is the second version where it's at a different facility under the control of the generator. And this is that third version that's sort of the tolling, manufacturing, and control of also the residual. So what is the definition of reclamation? A material is reclaimed if it is processed to recover a usable product or regenerated. I guess that makes sense. What about the definition of control? Is the power to direct the policies of the facility, whether by the ownership of stock, voting rights, or otherwise. And then tolling, HSM is transferred directly from tolling manufacturer to the tolling contractor for reclamation. And so this is kind of what I would say is one of the most important slides for us when we're talking about the generator controlled exclusion. That hazardous secondary material must be contained. And you note that I've kind of highlighted contained. There needs to be a notification that there's going to be a reliance upon the exclusion. That has to happen. There need to be some emergency preparedness and response requirements. There needs to be documentation of legitimate recycling, which in the case of certainly the printers is a really simple thing. Record keeping of the reclamation, and then some record keeping to refute speculative accumulation. And we'll talk a little bit more about, we'll kind of drill into each part of this. So of course we need to get into more definitions. The one that I find very important is to understand what does it mean to have things be contained? So it means that the unit is in good condition. There are no leaks or releases, that it's designed for hazardous secondary material. And by no leaks or releases, we talk about, the rule talks about unpermitted releases are releases that are not covered by a permit, such as a permit to discharge to water or air. They may include releases through surface transport by precipitation runoff, releases to soil and groundwater, windblown dust, fugitive air emissions, I kind of say that stressed, and then the last one, and catastrophic unit failures. So I am moving forward and my slide is not advancing. Uh-oh. Oh, there we go. Hello. Sorry about that. So contain also means that it's held in a unit that's properly labeled, and EPA has sort of given this example of a proper label for a tank system that has hazardous secondary material. It also means that it's in a unit that's compatible, and that its construction, it addresses potential risk of fire and explosion. That should be obvious. And then there are some parts in the rule that says that it's presumptively contained if you really meet the standards that are in 664, which primarily deals with the treatment, storage, and disposal facilities. And then in our 65, that would deal primarily with large quantity generators. So in summary, there's a definition in the code, but you can't have leaks, nothing visible. You've actually got to control air emissions. It needs to be labeled. And then if you meet the container or tank standards and you meet the RCRA air provisions that are in the rules, it's presumed to be contained. So record keeping for the generator controlled exclusion, really important. They need to be readily available. If a compliance person from EPA or from DNR comes to visit you, they need to be maintained for at least 3 years. They also need to document legitimacy. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And for different facilities, if there are multiple facilities, and if there are tolling agreements, those records also need to be kept. So an important part of that conditional exclusion is that notification. And so before relying upon the exclusion, or when one stops using the exclusion, you need to notify. And that's done through the 8700-12 form, which now has this addendum for HSM. And those fields are active. And then there needs to be reporting. I think it's every other year with reporting activities from even numbered years on the Haz Waste annual report. That would be out by March 1st of each odd year. And that needs to be this re-notification. That's again with 8700-12. And then the legitimate recycling as part of these records, there needs to be this written description of the factors that I'll talk about a little bit. And those need to be maintained for 3 years after that recycling operation has ceased. And then there also can't be speculative accumulation. And there's 6 criteria. They're kind of all pretty wordy, but sort of make sense. That the material is potentially recyclable and has a feasible means of being recycled, that in the calendar year, the amount of material recycled or transferred to a different site for recycling equals at least 75% by weight or volume. And then that the material accumulated speculatively in a storage unit has a label indicating the first date that material began to be accumulated and documented. There are a couple other factors for the speculative accumulation. We also have a guidance document on this. We'll go over that. I'll give you the links to the guidance documents. The other part that's important with the generator-based exclusion is the emergency preparedness and response. That's in the subchapter M of chapter 661 of our code. It kind of has 2 tiers for less than 6,000 kilograms. That's like on-site 6,000 kilograms. That's about 13,200 pounds of material on site. And then there's one that would be more or less like the LQG requirements. And those emergency preparedness and response would be very, very similar to the large quantity generator emergency preparedness and response plans. So kind of in summary with this, it's really the HSM rules, especially the generator-based exclusion, it provides opportunities with continuing responsibility. Once a material is managed as a hazardous waste, it can be managed as a conditionally excluded hazardous waste material. So it's not like you can just decide to do it one day. You have to sort of plan it and also follow those conditions of exclusion. And if a generator or a reclaimer doesn't meet any part of the exclusion, the generator and the reclaimer can't rely upon that exclusion. So that has compliance ramifications for sure. So a little example, and some of the words in here are just to try to confuse you a little bit. So let's say if the hazardous secondary material rules were not being used or weren't in the state of Wisconsin, say there's a facility that generates a lightly used solvent that gets transferred from a parts washer. Let's just say it's within permanent total enclosure to confuse things by a pump through, let's say, double-walled steel piping. All the joints are welded. And there are a series of valves, and it all goes to a 5,000-gallon stainless steel used solvent tank, and it looks perfect, beautiful. This used solvent tank is then also connected to a distillation unit, and that distillation unit generates some still bottoms and sends reclaimed solvent to a clean solvent tank. So, what Haz Waste rules apply to this situation, and which ones? And if the generator were to use the generator-based reclamation, how could it fall into the HSM? So, what changes would there be if the generator-based exclusion is followed? So right off the bat, without HSM and considering it, there's a lot of this stuff that would be subject to hazardous waste rules, even if it's going to a distillation unit. The only thing that I know for sure, if HSM is not considered and we haven't gone into HSM, is that distillation unit is a recycling unit and it's probably not part of the hazardous waste rules. But that tank prior to the still, yeah, that's a subchapter J that's going to cover that tank. A lot of that equipment is going to be probably subject to air emissions rules as well. So you can see there's a lot of stuff. Even if you had a pump or some valves that are in a totally enclosed, they still would be subject to the BB, the equipment, assuming you had 20% organic in that valve or that pump. So there are a lot of haz waste rules that come to play if HSM doesn't come isn't considered or used, I guess. So what if we did have a generator want to get into using HSM? All of a sudden, I say that there would be a lot of haz waste rules that wouldn't come into play. But what if they thought they wanted to rely upon HSM and they hadn't notified? What about if the transfer piping or the solvent or the used solvent tank, there was a lot of leaking? What if that tank had an open vent pipe or had some emissions that weren't covered by some air permit? So these are getting into that conditional aspect of HSM. So all of a sudden right here, you wouldn't be conditionally able to claim HSM if you hadn't notified, if you've got leaking. In other words, you need to have stuff, need to notify, things need to be contained. You get the picture here. So another aspect of the HSM was that transfer-based exclusion, and that allows a generator to send materials to a reclaimer that doesn't have a RCRA license, provided the generator has made reasonable efforts to ensure that the chosen reclaimer will properly and legitimately reclaim the hazardous secondary material and not to discard it. There are responsibilities. I'm not sure why my slides are not advancing on occasion. Let's see here.
There might be a slight delay, David. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure why it's a significant delay then.
Oh,
I'm sorry. Maybe it just gets hung up. But anyway, the next slides will basically show sort of what the responsibilities are for the generator for the transfer-based exclusion. And then it will show, yeah, I'm totally hung up here. Sorry about that. There we go. All right, well, maybe I touched something that's probably what I did. I had my cursor somewhere. So in terms of the generator requirements for the transfer-based exclusion, again, materials have to be legitimately recycled, no speculative accumulation, notification, that should all sound familiar, containment, reasonable efforts that the reclaimer is doing the right thing. There needs to be a contractual arrangement between the facility. There have to be some records maintained for offsite shipment and confirmation of receipt, and then notice and a consent for exports. And then there are requirements on the reclaimer side of the house, again, that it's legitimately recycled, blah, blah, blah. I'll let you guys look at it on your own time, but there are requirements on both sides, from the generator side and the reclaimer side. And this is a little graphic similar to the generator-based exclusion that shows the transfer-based exclusion. And in before the reclamation here for the transfer-based, it's worthwhile noting that for the intermediate facilities, they can hold on to that material for greater than 10 days. All right, so the definition of solid waste included a lot of provisions for hazardous secondary materials. It also included sort of a tied piece, which is this legitimate recycling. And just as some background, we know that sham recycling isn't legitimate. It's really recycling that isn't. It's, sham recycling is defined as disposal of hazardous waste in the guise of recycling, determining whether hazardous waste recycling is legitimate or sham depends really on case-by-case circumstances. So EPA had been grappling really since the beginning of the Haz Waste program in '85 to talk about legitimacy, and the DSW rule and the modifications that we made to our rules, explicitly prohibit sham recycling. It really made the regulations more transparent, more enforceable, and so it sort of brought these things that had been these standards that had been in many guidance document and eventually into rule, into also Wisconsin rules. And it's pretty much, there are four main parts to it, and there are three things that have to be met. And again, this is really with documentation. The first one is that hazardous secondary material must provide a useful contribution to the recycling process or to a product or intermediate. Two, that recycling must produce a valuable product or intermediate. Three, hazardous secondary material must be managed as a valuable commodity. And then the things that must be considered, the product or recycling must be comparable to a legitimate product or intermediate. To me, for the printer sector and spent solvents, this is a really easy thing to document, really easy. It becomes more difficult when you have much more, I would say, less valuable items that you're trying to reclaim or distill in this case. So we are winding down. I'm not even sure what we're doing for time. I probably ran through everything so quickly. But again, we'll have some time for questions. We have published not that long ago 4 different guidance documents, and in the presentation we have links to those. And these are little screenshots of what they have. There's one dealing with hazardous waste tanks, because sometimes you're going to have to deal with those one way or another. And then the 3 others are dealing with mostly HSM related things: the generator-based exclusion, the transfer-based exclusion, and then there's one specific to legitimate recycling and speculative accumulation. And then for extra credit, you can read the final rule at the federal level, and there's a whole bunch of information there. One thing that I find really, really useful is McCoy's white paper on the definition of solid waste, and really talking much more, I would say, in-depth background as well as interpretation of those federal rules. So I would highly recommend the McCoy's white paper. I think we've gotten to this point, and are you ready? I get to
Yes.
breathe a sigh of relief for
Absolutely.
covering a lot of slides.
Yeah, fantastic material, David. We really appreciate you presenting. We have a few questions. Can you explain the structural support comment regarding hazardous waste tanks? I didn't understand what this pertains to specifically.
Yeah. I mean, so basically, legs on the side of a tank holding it up would be structural support. Legs that might be anchored to concrete. Any kind of a pedestal potentially would be that structural support. Basically, that it's able to stay on its own. It's pretty simple, I guess. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Do you have a tank to store solvent waste in order to take advantage of the HSM exclusion?
I think it really depends on the facility. Oftentimes, accumulation of hazardous secondary material makes a lot of sense depending on how you're running your distillation unit. It's essentially used as a feed tank, and oftentimes it makes a lot of sense. So yeah, I would say oftentimes, and in the past, before HSM was in play, we really, facilities had to grapple with dealing with the subchapter J requirements. It doesn't mean that you should have a tank that's leaking. You need to have a tank in good condition, but that kind of goes without saying.
Mm-hmm. By the way, if there's anyone that has questions, please continue to put them in the chat, and I will ask David as they come in. We have another. I have to count the amount of hazardous waste that I am reclaiming through one of the HSM exclusions towards my generator classification?
So the question is whether you need to count those things? No. I mean, all of a sudden, this is the conditional exclusion, that you're pulling these things out of the haz waste realm into another outside of haz waste rules. So if you're meeting the exclusions for HSM, you're counting them just for knowing whether you're going to be falling in, what status for HSM rules, but they won't go to generator status anymore. So potentially one could drop even generator status.
Excellent. Before you get to this question, I want to soften you up by saying that this individual said you had a great presentation, but it is a little bit longer. Can you speak to labeling guidance for all various parts to a system being managed by HSM?
Beyond tank systems, is that the question? Like what labeling?
Didn't speak, but how should a generator label for drums, tanks, piping that contain clean distilled solvent? How should we label drums, tanks, and piping with dirty solvent destined to be claimed on site? If you look at using EPA example label, it is superfluous information and would not be appropriate for all parts of HSM system.
Yeah. Agreed. I mean, ultimately, it's probably the folks that are generating the material that would have the best ideas. I mean, to me, it's always really helpful if I visit a facility and I understand, oh, here's my clean solvent tank. That's obviously it would be even outside of HSM. All of a sudden, it's a product. It's not even HSM. Do I want to know what are the lines of HSM? Sure, that's really helpful. How does that get labeled? Well, it kind of depends on the facility, but to know that something is product versus HSM versus HSM accumulation, it's pretty site specific, but it's really helpful. It's really helpful to understand the flow of materials. And that's what I would say is that, do I know the perfect answer? No, but I've seen a lot of facilities that have color coding, that have specific labels, even on equipment. The more explicit one can be, if all of this stuff is excluded, say excluded HSM pump, transfer line, tank, all of it. And, that in conjunction with all of the records that are kept, it's very clear to anybody coming in, whether you're getting audited by a third party, whether it's EPA, whether it's DNR, whether it's anybody, what this stuff is. And if somebody's not on site and they know everything about it and stuff's labeled, it's pretty easy, I think, especially from the compliance side, just to understand what is part of HSM. And it could be a whole bunch of stuff that in the past was hazardous waste. There still might be areas that are generating hazardous waste, maybe like the still bottoms, for example.
Someone had sent in a suggestion. Is to also consider labeling so that new employees who come in are aware of their surroundings. And then it would also be helpful for inspections and those who are managing the system.
Yes, I totally agree with that one. That's a good comment.
Excellent. Well, David, we have no more questions or comments. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. It was a great presentation. Also want to thank all that participated today. Again, a recording will be sent to you with some information here in the near future. With that, thank you so much and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you very much.